Hello, welcome to the Ponderings podcast. This is Milo. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about Whitehead's Prehensions and going to be comparing it to active inference, Karl Friston's active inference, and his free energy principle. But before I do that, I just wanted to give some updates. I'm thinking of making this podcast a little more like free form, a little more improvised. I'm still going to have my outlines, but I'm not going to be reading exactly from the outline. I'm going to sort of have it as a guideline, but I'm going to focus more on like explaining these concepts and sort of thinking at the same time. And yeah, it's just a little more free form. So I'm going to be combining Karl Friston and some cognitive science things to Whitehead. And if you have any questions on him or anything on his theories, please ask me so I can clarify it a little better. I'm still trying to clarify his philosophy for myself, so I'll be revisiting his main ideas over and over again and comparing them to scientific and philosophical theories. So please, if you have any questions, I'll be willing to answer or clarify some things. Yeah, again, I'm still trying to clarify his thought. It's sort of something that you have to do is like go back to his terms over and over again until it starts to make sense. It's very cyclical. So, yeah. And his theory is primarily concerned with metaphysics. And metaphysics is sort of giving broad and general topics that are supposed to be applicable to like the universe. So it's a theory of everything, a theory to encompass like the whole universe and what he thinks of it. So whatever theories come out of it, like prehensions, concretions, all these terms that he's created for his philosophy, it's supposed to fit together and be encompassed in this scheme. So I wanted to recap some of these terms: actual entities, eternal objects, prehensions, concretions. All these are really difficult to understand, but again, with more exposure, it'll start to make some sense, hopefully. It's starting to make some sense for me, but I think for me, the difficult part is trying to explain it in terms that are not his. Because whenever I try to say, like, oh, actual entities, occasions of experience, prehensions, it could seem very, like, what the hell are you talking about? So I'll try to explain it in different terms and less jargon, less philosophical jargon. Alright, so you could think of actual entities as things that are perpetually perishing. It's like the philosopher Heraclitus talked about how you can't step in the same river twice. So basically, process philosophy has to do with the fact that things are always changing and they're never the same thing. Even in a moment, that moment is gone the next second. So actual entities are made up of all those moments beforehand that create that specific entity. So the entity, we can think of it as us. It's not necessarily a soul or a self. It's more like a self that's been like constructed by past experiences. And it's continuing to grow. It's continuing to construct itself by the present experiences that it's having and also the future possible experiences that it's going to have. So I guess that's how you can look at what we are according to Alfred North Whitehead. We're not a soul that's like permanent, that, you know, when we die there's like a soul. It's more like we are creations and we are still being created by like ourselves, our systems, the society and the environment we're in. It's a co-creative process, if that makes sense. So again, for Whitehead, we're not like this permanent subject or soul, but instead he calls it actual entity. So it's made up of actual occasions of experience, those drops of experiences that are in the past. I have here on my outline, I wrote subject, superject. And for Whitehead, this means that we insert ourselves into creation. So we affect the environment as much as the environment affects us. So we're not a soul or a subject, but we're a subject superject. So we have a subjective unity of experience. It's like all the related events that have to do with this body and anything that's relevant to this body would be considered the subjective unity of experience. And all those occasions of experience, they concrete into this subjective unity of experience. So that's how we have a conventional sort of self roaming around. It's because all these occasions have decided to like concrete. So that'll sort of help with the theory of prehension, because prehension is sort of that process of how concretion happens in a actual entity. So before that, before I get into prehensions, I want to talk about the bifurcation of nature. Bifurcation is not a scary word. It just means division. It's the division. It has to do with the division of mind and body when I'm talking about bifurcation of nature. So again, mind and body duality, it was proposed by Descartes' philosophy, and it's been prevalent in most of Western thought. It's that like the body and everything in nature is mechanical, and then there's consciousness or mind, and that would be separate. So Whitehead is like, no, this does not make sense. We should actually look at ourselves as events. The body and nature isn't completely just purely mechanical. It's not that. There's more going on. There's like nature and all of this is alive, and mind is completely embodied. It permeates all of nature in different degrees. So there's advanced levels of cognition, and then there's different lower levels of cognition, and then there's some parts in nature that don't have cognition. So, but that doesn't mean that it's like separate from the body. It's just like different levels of complexity in nature. So again, Whitehead is like, no, there's no division between mind and body. It's actually very interconnected and interdependent. So I wanted to talk about some different terms, disembodiment versus embodiment. So the difference between disembodiment, again, it's like the mind and body. Descartes would see like, okay, there's a soul, and then there's the mechanical body that we use to like efficiently move around. There's mechanical matter. Everything is mechanical in nature. So that would be disembodied. We're not connected to our body. We could take out our brain and put it in a vat, and it would still work just fine without a body, as long as there's like some sort of world simulation. And obviously Whitehead's like, that doesn't make any sense, because the only way we're able to perceive or even think or have a self is because we are perceiving with a body. We are in a body that is in a world. We cannot abstract these from each other. We cannot be without being a body in a world. It's all very connected. And then the terms indirect perception versus direct perception. So indirect perception would say that how we perceive is indirectly. The book I see there is only the I don't actually see the book. What I see is a representation of it in my mind. So it's not the actual thing, because there's a filter in my mind that puts it all together to make it like, oh, there's the book. Whitehead would not agree with indirect perception. He would say, no, we have direct perception. Direct perception means that whatever we're seeing is actually there. So everything in the world is what actually exists. There isn't an extra filter, or there isn't this like abstract or transcendent reality that we're filtering things through. And then another terms that I want to go through, substance versus process. Again, substance is, for Whitehead, he'd see it as something permanent and static, and he'd say, no, actually everything is a process. Everything is always changing. There's nothing permanent. There's nothing static. Everything is sort of being created and growing and going into a sort of creative advance forward. Alright, another two terms that I want to sort of clarify is Whitehead's distinction between actuality versus potentiality. So for Whitehead, what's actual is what exists concretely, and then what is potential would be what exists abstractly. So, earlier I said, oh, there's nothing that sort of can be abstracted from the universe. So for Whitehead, he would call this eternal objects. This is a little difficult to explain, but I'm going to try my best. So you have the actual entity. I wish I could draw a picture. Maybe in the future I'll draw a picture for this to try and figure out how to explain it. But okay, so you have the actual entity, and it has all its previous occasions of experiences that has come together to make it into that present self thing with its subjective unity of experience. And this subjective unity of experience has very many possibilities to go into. So to grow, it has okay, these are the choices that I have, and these are the kinds of things that I am going to prehend or not prehend to continue to grow. So what's actual, so the possibilities would be made up of either actual, other actual entities, actual occasions, or they'd be made of eternal objects. So what I mean by eternal objects is the eternal objects are past actual entities. So when moments pass, they don't just perish, they remain in the world. They're history. So it's history, and it's all the past occasions of experience that become immortal, eternal objects. So this is very abstract, but it's not that it's not made out of nothing. It's made out of the past, and every moment this actual entity that was in that moment, it perishes and goes into the past and becomes an eternal object. So eternal objects aren't completely abstracted from the world. They're made from the world, and they're there for for us to prehend. And it's a little difficult. I'm still trying to figure out what he's trying to say by this too. So I think as I go along with these podcasts, I'll understand more of what he's trying to say by these terms, and also hopefully I'll be able to explain it better. But for now, that's sort of the idea that I have about his eternal objects. It's sort of the past actual entities, actual occasions that have perished, but not completely perished. They're now just potentialities for the future actual entities, if that makes sense. So again, the actual entities are the only actual things, they're the only concrete things, and then eternal objects are the past actual entities. So why did he term it eternal objects? So it's supposed to sort of go back to Plato's forms. So his theory of forms is that, so let's say, so I have this table here. There's an ultimate form, according to Plato, that would represent a table. And that's like the ideal table. And that's how we have this knowledge of a table. Or like other forms are like the form of good. How do we know that things are good? It's because we have an idea of, we have a sort of a, that form, the idea of the form is in our mind. And we're like, oh, it's good because it has those qualities of the form good. So for Whitehead, eternal objects are sort of having, it's sort of related to Platonic forms, not in the sense that it's like, oh, there's like these ideals out there. It's more like it's the ideals that have been created in history, or like we have an idea of good because of past actual entities, because of past occasions of experience. We have these ideas of bad because of past events, past occasions of experience, memories, for instance. So it's, eternal objects would be close to Platonic forms, but not in the abstract sense. It's more like they're made up of the past, basically. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about Karl Friston's active inference. So first, he's a neuroscientist. He developed the free energy principle. And this free energy principle is that the organism limits its potential states to only a select amount, so that it is not overwhelmed. So, in other words, we're only aware of a specific amount of potential states to sort of grow into, to choose. We're only aware of a very small amount of things. So I'm going to define a couple terms and then sort of go into what he's talking about. So entropy, it means how predictable an outcome or the possible outcomes are. Entropy is also can be compared to just chaos. So entropy would be just all of everything. And low entropy would be less chaos. There's less of that. A high entropy would be more chaos. And for Whitehead, for Karl Friston, free energy means that there's a lot of chaos or there's a lot of indeterminacy. So the point of active inference is the fact that we're always trying to minimize chaos, minimize the indeterminacy. We're trying to predict the possible outcomes better. So then we sort of minimize the entropy. So yeah, any adaptive change will minimize free energy. So since we're a fetus, or when we're born, we start to sort of adapt to things because we want the world to make more sense to us. But again, the way we are adapting is forming the world we are perceiving, if that makes any sense. So yeah, as actual entities, prehending other actual entities and eternal objects. So again, as selves that take in other so-called selves not actual selves, more like events, occasions, drops of experience. As we take in other experiences and eternal objects, so past experiences, it concresces to produce novel togetherness. So that's in like Whitehead's terms. So in Karl Friston's, it would be there is a limited amount of possibilities for every organism's root. So their historical root, there's a limited amount of possibilities that you choose from. And active inference means that it's sort of, we're trying to predict what the world is doing. And sometimes our predictions are wrong, and that's when we start to feel like upset or frustrated, because it's like, why didn't it work out the way that I wanted it to? Well, the world works out as it does. Sometimes we don't predict it accurately. But it's just our brain trying to minimize the chaos of the world. It's trying to make sense of things by making it more predictable. Well, it's not making the outside more predictable. We're just trying to have more predictable ways of maneuvering in the world. So yeah, again, free energy is prediction error. So it's to minimize surprise. The brain adapts by predicting. Prediction is can be compared to recognition. So we're trying to recognize the world around us. And from a child to growing up, we're adapting and recognizing more and more experiences. We're trying to lessen the chaos and lessen the uncertainty. We want more certainty. So I kind of wanted to go over a couple terms. There's Bayesian inference versus active inference, autopoiesis, open systems. All these terms would help in the future just to sort of understand like biology and how we sort of form with if we're thinking of biology in more of a like embodied or cognitive science sort of way. So autopoiesis is the term for living organisms that are self-organizing and self-regulating. So for instance, we can think of a cell. A cell it self-organizes and it self-regulates, but it doesn't do this independently. It has a membrane that is permeable. It's open, but it's also closed enough so that it doesn't enmesh with the environment. But it's open enough so that it receives things and it also gives things to the environment. So there's an exchange going on that is dynamic. Again, the environment and the cell are not completely separate, but they're separate enough to have a distinct sort of identity, which would be called autopoiesis. And autopoiesis is a term that was first coined by Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana. They're neuroscientists, cognitive scientists. They wrote about autopoiesis in The Embodied Mind. And yeah, autopoiesis is a pretty cool concept once you start to learn about it. At least for me, it helped me see things a little differently, how things develop, and it helps you have an idea about the self that is more in tune with process philosophy. So again, that things are a process and it's a sort of dynamic circular causality. The environment affects you, you affect the environment. You have an open membrane, but it's closed enough that you are a you. You are a self. It's closed enough that you have a sort of conventional self, but it's open enough that you're still very, very interdependent and interconnected to other beings, other autopoietic systems, and the environment. So, pretty cool stuff. But yeah, dynamic interaction. in exchange with the environment that you're situated in. And again, it's all whatever is relevant to you. You're obviously not exchanging with other beings that are on like the other side of the world or in different galaxies. You're interacting locally, but obviously non-local things will affect you because it's like a chain. Whatever affects others will eventually sort of reach down to you in a sort of chain of connections. But so yeah, I wanted to talk about Bayesian inference versus active inference because this is something that Karl Friston talks about a lot. For Bayesian inference, it's they update the system as more information becomes available. And then for active inference, it's similar, but it has more to do with updating the system with more engagement with the environment. So our perception is enslaved by actions. The only way to minimize disorder is to keep experiencing. It's having flexibility and change. It's adapting. So we need to keep experiencing in order to keep minimizing entropy, keep sort of tweaking our prediction machine. Except, we're not machines, but our cognitive system is complex enough to create predictions in order to make more sense out of the world so that we can function without having to always think about every little detail. Like, we can just function like autopilot. So, all right. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Whitehead's positive prehensions. Talk a little more about his prehensions, and then we'll sort of tie it all together. So positive prehension, can be compared to active inference. It's an action of grasping or seizing. So prehensions, it's sort of like it's not a prediction, but it's a grasping of the potentialities that are out there. And it would be the relevant potentialities or the relevant actualities in the actual world that we're grasping. So we're minimizing free energy by actively making decisions. Positive prehension is the relationship of seizing or grasping other actual entities and eternal objects to integrate into one's subjective unity of experience. So our subjective unity of experience is a unity because of all the prehensions that we have sort of brought into all of these actions of prehension, all of the things that we have taken into ourselves. And also it's made up of all the relationships that are negative. So all of the things that we've avoided or not accepted into our autopoietic system, all the things that we've rejected, that can also count as a relationship. So it's made up, prehensions are sort of relationships between everything else in the world and your subjective unity of experience. So prehensions don't always have to be conscious. So it's not an active decision. It's just an ongoing process of taking in like experiences or rejecting different experiences or perceptions, sensations, and that's sort of creating our actual entity, our momentary actual entity. If that makes any sense. But so positive apprehension is sort of like a feeling. It's the things that we're feeling, and a subjective unity of experience would be that overall feeling in our being. All the things that we're taking in, all the sensations that we're taking in, and also all the sensations that we're not taking in or not experiencing. So again, concrescence is the production of novel togetherness. So all these prehensions come together to produce something new, a new actual entity, and then the old actual entity becomes an eternal object, which can be used which is always used. Our previous actual entity, we prehend it into our being, and that's how we sort of keep being the same person. Not necessarily the same person, but we have this idea of like, oh, I'm Milo, or oh, I'm whatever, because we're sort of continuing this idea, this being. It continues to self-organize, continues to self-regulate, and the idea sort of continues on because of the eternal objects that we prehend. So I wrote some things down about prehensions. Prehensions have 3 factors. We have the subject prehending, the datum, which is prehended, and the subjective form, which is how the subject prehends the datum. So the datum for Whitehead would be like the data, whatever data we're taking in, the senses, the actual entities, eternal objects, all that. That would be considered sort of the datum that is prehended. And then we are the subject that prehends. We're the subject that grasps and takes in the data. So, or another definition for datum would be a physical feeling of another actual entity. And actual entity doesn't have to do with like another person or self. It could just be another occasion of experience. That would be considered an actual entity. We're just in a more complex actual entity. We're a complex autopoietic system made up of many systems that self-regulate and self-organize, but instead they all work together to make this person, right? So an objective datum is a feeling felt by a later actual entity. So objective datum would be the eternal objects prehended. So there's like datum that are happening, that are subjective, which would be the physical feelings, the things, how we feel about what we're taking in. And then there's the objective datum, which would be the eternal objects. So how to sort of tie this into active inference, we can think of the datum being all of the things, the senses that are sort of coming to us, and we are, for active inference terms, we're trying to lessen the chaos, lessen the amount of information that we're bringing in. And so to lessen the amount of information that we're bringing in, we have only a select amount that we sort of have available, or that because we're trying to predict, we lessen the amount of information, if that makes sense. Alright, so for the subjective form, to define that, there's 5 factors. There's how the subject which feels. So, for instance, me, I'm the subject that prehends. The initial data which is felt, so other actual entities, other occasions. The elimination of unnecessary data, so the negative prehension, which is we're eliminating things that we don't want to feel, or they're just not relevant to our unity of experience. There's the objective datum, which is felt. That's number 4. It's the eternal objects, potentials, possibilities, and then the subjective form itself, feeling the objective datum. Subjective forms are emotions, valuations, purposes, aversions, consciousness, that which is a continuation of the subjective unity of experience. So again, free energy would be all the actual entities and eternal objects. The minimization of free energy would be the positively prehended datum. The elimination of chaos or disorder would be the negatively prehended. The subjective form is the predictive continuation that has access to relevant possibilities. What one values, what one has aversion towards, what one is attracted to, etc. Right? And prehensions are always derived from an antecedent experience. So, again, it has to do with a historical root this historical root sort of gives us the information on how to predict the environment around us. And we're not like predicting the future, things like that, but we're just trying to maneuver in a more, we're just trying to be in the world, but not be overwhelmed by all of the information, all of the data that's like bombarding us at all times. Instead, the only things that we're sort of conscious of, or the only things that we're sort of prehending, are the things that are most relevant, sort of local to our subjective unity. So we can see active inference as a sort of creative advance. We're constantly predicting, we're constantly tweaking our prediction system, and we're constantly predicting how to move forward, how to act in the world. And we're trying to make things make sense more and more, and make things less uncertain, so that we could engage with the world without being overwhelmed. So the neuronal activity accumulates evidence for prediction error. All of our cognitive capacity is always taking in information. The neuronal activity is taking in information and tweaking the prediction system, trying to suppress all of the free energy so that it makes more sense for us, so that we can self-organize and self-preserve in a more like, what's the word? Just an easier way for us to sort of live, really. So yeah, I hope that sort of clears things up a little, or maybe my rambling sort of made it even more confusing. But I'm going to try to do this more often, where I compare Whitehead's theories of prehensions, concretion, just his philosophy of organism, comparing it to like more recent cognitive science or neuroscience, or even like physics or things like that. I just want to sort of bring his really complex and hard to understand philosophy and bring it into more relevant fields of today, so that it makes more sense. So I hope that maybe you have a little better understanding of positive prehensions, if by looking at it through sort of active inference, free energy principle sort of lens. I don't know, that's what I thought of when I was first learning about the positive prehensions. I was like, oh, it's sort of like active inference. But yeah, next episode I'm thinking of talking more about negative prehensions and comparing it to quantum decoherence. That'll be sort of difficult, but it might be kind of fun. It'll sort of be the first spooky cast episode for the month of October. So gotta start spooky with some quantum, because it's very scary, yes. Alright, well, thank you for listening. I do have some final thoughts, though. Here I wrote down plasticity. I guess I wanted to talk about how cool thinking of our existence as more of like a malleable, adaptive creation. Like it's always going through adaptations, and it's always changing and growing and tweaking and complexifying. It's like comparing it to physics conception of how the universe is always expanding. We're a part of an expansive universe, and we're always expanding as well until we eventually perish. But even then, we're immortal in a sense, because we become eternal objects for other people or other things to prehend. Our information doesn't go away. So it's always gonna be there as an eternal object for other beings to prehend. That's kind of cool. Just some thoughts, but alright, well, I hope this freeform sort of podcast was maybe easier to understand or follow along. Maybe it wasn't, I don't know. I kind of liked it. A lot more casual, a lot more of me trying to figure out how to explain these things, but it's pretty cool. Alright, well, thank you for listening, and I hope you stay tuned. Talk to you next time.